Hello, children. This is Grandma Carla with more of Emily's Runaway Imagination by Beverly Cleary. We are on Chapter 4. Grandpa and the Tin Lizzy. Grandpa's mind was made up. He was going to buy an automobile. Yes, Grandpa said times were changing. Horse and buggy days were at an end. He wanted to keep up with the times, and so he was going to buy a Ford, a Model T Ford. Emily thought this was terribly exciting, Grandpa keeping up with the times in a new automobile. She had always thought Grandpa was a pretty old-fashioned guy, even if he did not wear a beard. Why, he still called electricity juice. "Switch off the light," he would say. "We don't want to waste the juice." But now Grandpa was going to change his ways, and Emily was going to be closely related to an automobile. When the boys and the girls at school bragged about their family's automobiles, Emily had always said proudly, "We don't have an automobile. We have a tractor." It seemed as if everybody had a different opinion about Grandpa's buying an automobile. Grandma could not see why he wanted such a contraption. My land, a person could walk any place he wanted to go in Pitchfork, and when was he going to find time to drive, when the store opened until all hours? Mama said that she'd hoped that he wouldn't do anything reckless at his age. Daddy just laughed and said let him have his fun. Grandpa's customers jostled him about his plans to buy an automobile. Every morning the old men would come in to sit around the store while they waited for Uncle Avery to sort the morning mail. And they asked, "Well, Will, have you bought that Tin Lizzy yet?" Emily was on pins and needles for fear that Grandpa might change his mind about keeping up with the times. But at last the great day came. Mama and Emily went uptown to help Grandma mind the store, while Grandpa took the new auto stage to McMinnville to buy the Model T Ford. Emily practiced trying to shake open her paper bag with a flourish and a snap, the way Grandma did, so that people would look at her with admiration and say, "The way that girl snaps paper bags." While she tried and tried, Grandma fussed and worried and declared it was foolishness for Grandpa to drive back to McMinnville in that contraption when he had never driven before. Late in the afternoon, Mama kept going out to the porch and peering down Main Street in direction of McMinnville. Emily could not see what they were so worried about. What was there to driving an automobile besides starting, stopping, and in a pinch backing up? Old George A. Barbie had explained it all to Grandpa before he left that morning. There was nothing to it except sometimes on a steep hill it was necessary to turn around and back up the hill so that the gasoline could run down to the engine. "Mercy!" Grandma would exclaim, going out to peer down Main Street. "I hope he hasn't hit a cow the way old George A. did that time." It was Emily, tired of trying to shake open paper bags, who went out to sit on the front porch steps and saw Grandpa driving down the road as nice as you please. "He's coming!" she shouted. "He's coming!" Mama, Grandma, and all the customers rushed out to the sidewalk to watch Grandpa's arrival. There he came, down the road, across the bridge, and up Main Street, beaming and triumphant. He drew up in front of his store. "Whoa!" he cried as he stopped his new automobile. "William, you made it!" exclaimed Grandma in relief. "Of course I made it," answered Grandpa, climbing over the door on the driver's side, which was not made to be opened. Everyone clustered around to inspect and admired Grandpa's new black touring car. Old George A. Barbie was there to open the hood and inspect the engine. Old George A., as everyone in Pitchfork called him, was the town's authority on Fords because he had been the first one to own one. Emily was a little disappointed because the Ford did not have a vase for flowers on the dashboard, but it did have a number of features that made up for it. The little brass radiator ornament and the red, white, and blue cans for extra water, gas, and oil that were mounted on the running board. Because Emily was related to the car, she felt free to climb into the front seat and bounce up and down on the black leather cushion. "Come along," Emily said, "Mama. It's time to go home and fix supper." "Mama," protested Emily, I want to go for a ride." "Not today," said Mama firmly. "Come along. I'll drive you home," offered Grandma. "No, thank you," answered Mama. "There are too many customers for Mother to handle alone. Come along, Emily." Bitterly disappointed, Emily climbed out of the car. "But Mama," protested Emily as she turned off the cement sidewalk onto the boardwalk, "I've been waiting all day to ride in Grandpa's Model T." "Now, Emily," said Mama firmly, "you are not to set foot in that automobile for a good long time. I just don't trust your grandfather's driving." "Mama!" wailed Emily. And so, as the days went by, Emily's mother made up excuses to keep Emily out of her grandfather's automobile, and Emily watched wistfully as he rattled around town, keeping up with the times. Grandpa was not the only person keeping up with the times. The Ladies' Civic Club had found space for a library in a corner of the commercial club rooms upstairs over the Pitchfork State Bank. Two ladies loaned old china closets and with glass doors that could be locked to be used for bookshelves. Mama was appointed librarian. Now all they needed was books. Mama wrote a letter, which was published on the front page of the Pitchfork Report. She asked anyone who had a book to give the library to leave it in a box in Grandpa's store. She also asked anybody to subscribe to the county gentleman at $1 a year to telephone her. If the library could get 5 subscriptions, it would receive 5 new books absolutely free. The 75 books loaned by the state library would arrive any day now. Then one Sunday, when the store was closed and no one had banged on the door to get Grandpa to open up, Grandpa and Grandma drove over to the farm in the new Ford. Grandma was wearing her new serge suit and her best hat. She had a resigned, do-or-die look on her gentle face. "Come on," said Grandpa. "We've come to take the whole family for a ride." "Good," said Daddy. "I've been itching to go for a ride." This time there was no way out for Mama. Emily and her mama and her father climbed into the back seat. Grandpa got out and cranked the car, and he cranked it and he cranked it. Finally, the engine started with a noise of machinery sneezing, and the automobile began to shimmy. Grandpa ran around and climbed in fast, and off they drove, trailing 2 brown veils of dust behind them. Fong Kwok, who was out tending his vegetable garden, shouted and waved. Grandpa honked his horn in reply. "Ooga! Ooga! Mercy!" exclaimed Grandma as Grandpa whizzed around the corner onto Main Street. "Ooga! Ooga!" Grandpa honked at a boy on a bicycle. Mama looked nervous. Daddy beamed. Emily waved to everyone she saw. What a ride they had. Down Main Street, past the school, down an unpaved road trailing dust and scattering chicken, up Depot Road, around to Main Street, back up the road to the farm. They had not had a single accident. They had not hit a cow or even a chicken. "Say, Emily," said Grandpa before he and Grandma drove off, "how would you like to drive out to the old Skinner place with me in the morning?" The old Skinner place was a piece of land which Grandpa owned and which was farmed for him by a nearby farmer. Several people had owned it since the Skinners had sold it back around 1890. But in Pitchfork, land was almost always called after the name of the pioneer who had taken up the donation land claim. "Oh, Grandpa, I would love to," answered Emily quickly. Mama hesitated before she said, "Mrs. Scott phoned to say that she had some books to give to the library, but no way to get into town. Perhaps you could stop at the Scott place and pick them up." It was all right. At last Emily was free to ride in Grandpa's Ford and keep up with the times, too. The next morning, bright and early, Grandpa drove up to the farm for Emily, who was waiting for him at the gate out by the catalpa tree. This was going to be even better than Emily had hoped, because Grandpa had put down the stop of his car. Mama still looked worried, came out of the porch to wave goodbye. Unfortunately, Emily and Grandpa had to pass old George A. Barbie's house on the way out of town. When the old gentleman heard them approaching, he crawled out from under his own Model T Ford and hailed them. Naturally, Grandpa had to stop, although he did not turn off the engine. Old George A. came over and leaned against Grandpa's automobile. Emily could see that he had settled down for a good long talk about the insides of Fords. Emily squirmed around on the leather seat while the two old men discussed how such tiresome things as spindle jolt joint anti-rattlers, slipping clutches, low bands that might burn out, the advantages of a Ruxtel axle. It seemed to her that the chugging motor was as eager to be off as she was. Finally, Emily simply could not stand it. "Grandpa," she said urgently above the noise of the engine, "don't you think we'd better go?" "Yes, Emily, I expect we'd better," agreed Grandpa. "Well, thanks for the advice, George A." At last, they were on their way. It was a beautiful day for a drive in the country in an automobile with the top down. The fields were green. The sky was blue with whipped cream clouds. Wild roses and Queen Anne's lace bloomed along the fences. Blackbirds glistened in the sun. If Grandpa's automobile had not been making so much noise, they could have heard the meadowlarks. The road was good and bumpy, and Emily enjoyed every bump they hit. "Can you go faster, Grandpa?" she asked. Grandpa pulled down the gas lever on the steering wheel. The Ford leaped ahead. Emily jounced and bounced around on the leather seat, but she managed to look at the needle on the speedometer which Grandpa had installed. "Grandpa," she shrieked, "we are going 25 miles an hour." The joy and the wonder of it, tearing along at 25 miles an hour. They stopped under the old maple in front of the Scott place while Mrs. Scott ran out with their books for the library. Emily was much disappointed, although she was careful not to let Mrs. Scott, a tired, wispy little woman, know it. There were only 3 books, all of them very old, with yellowed paper and fine print, Kenilworth, and 2 books of sermons. No Black Beauty. Emily thanked her. It was nice of her to give her books, the only books she had. Farther out in the country, the wagon road to the old Skinner place wound through several farms, and at each farm Grandpa had to stop and climb out over the door. He opened the gate, climbed back into his Ford, drove through, got out, and closed the gate, climbed back in, and drove on to the next gate. The first section of the road led them through a barnyard, where Grandpa had to swerve to avoid some chickens and a calf. Finally, they reached the old Skinner place. How quiet it was with the engine of Grandpa's car turned off. Grandpa climbed out to examine his alfalfa crop, while Emily picked a bouquet of wild columbine growing along the fence to take home to Mama. "Come on, Emily," Grandpa called at last. "Time to go. I don't want to leave your grandmother alone with the store all morning." Emily started to climb up on the running board with her bouquet of columbine when she heard a sound. At first, she thought it was a tractor, but then she realized it was not. It was an airplane. "Look, Grandpa," she cried, pointing. "An airplane!" "By George, you're right," exclaimed Grandpa, shading his eyes with his hand. "Grandpa, I see the aviator," cried Emily ecstatically, and she could. She could see his brown leather jacket and helmet and even his goggles. What an exciting morning this was! She waved frantically. The man in the airplane waved to her over the side of the cockpit. It was almost too much to bear. She had been waved at by an aviator. "Grandpa, he waved!" Emily could hardly believe it. She stood watching until the airplane disappeared in the distance. Then she climbed into the Ford and slammed the door. The things that she had to tell Mama. Emily and her grandfather were not even near the first gate when Grandpa began to work the clutch pedal up and down. It seemed lifeless under his foot. "Grandpa," Emily was alarmed. Great Scott! Grandpa was alarmed too. Now what the Sam Hill was it old George A. said to do in a case like this? He pumped the clutch once more before it came to him. He said, "If this ever happened, I'd better not stop, because I couldn't get it started again unless I was on a hill." "Then don't stop," begged Emily. Right here, all of the hills were in the distance, where they could do no good. "We're coming to the gate," yelled Grandpa. "You can't stop," shouted Emily. The gate seemed to be flying toward her. "Grandpa, don't stop." "I've got to," yelled Grandpa. "No," shrieked Emily, "we'll never get home." My goodness, if she didn't get home, Mama would worry and she would never get to go for a ride again. Just when Emily thought they were going to crash into the gate, Grandpa turned aside and his automobile went bounding along in his alfalfa crop. Grandpa drove around and around in a circle. "It's no use, Emily," he said. "I'll have to stop. There's nothing else to do. We can hike to the nearest farm and get a farmer with a team to tow us back to town." "No, wait, Grandpa," begged Emily. "Be towed back to town behind old-fashioned horses? I should say not. Grandpa and his wonderful new automobile would be the laughingstock of Pitchfork. Besides, it would take all morning or longer, and Emily was so very anxious not to worry Mama. "If you drive real slow," she suggested, "I could jump out and open the gate." "Emily, you might get hurt," protested Grandpa. "No, I won't," Emily assured him. "I'll be careful." "I guess I could see how slow I can drive." Grandpa sounded dubious, but he was not eager to be towed back by horses either. He was proud of his Ford, and he wanted to ride back in style. They slowed down until they were bouncing gently over the ruts. Emily held her breath for fear the engine might stop altogether, and there they would be in the middle of an alfalfa field miles from nowhere. "You're sure you can do it?" asked Grandpa. "I'm sure." Emily laid her bouquet of columbines on the seat. She opened the door and looked down. The ground was passing by faster than she had expected. She took a deep breath and jumped. She stumbled and fell, skinning her knee. Never mind. It was half sock weather, and her knee would heal. "I'm all right," she called out, and while Grandpa speeded up and went on driving in circles through the alfalfa, she ran to the gate, climbed up, and lifted off the ring of wire that secured it to the fence post. She pushed off with one foot, and riding the gate, she swung out across the road. If she had not been so worried, it would have been fun. Swinging on gates was forbidden at home. Grandpa drove through the gate and started going around in circles in the next field. Emily hopped off the gate before the dust had settled and pushed and shoved until it was closed once more. She slipped the circle of wire back in place and ran after the Ford. She had worked fast because this field of wheat did not belong to Grandpa, and the farmer who owned it might not like Grandpa driving around on his crop. Emily was glad it was a field of wheat and not a prune orchard. Grandpa would have had a terrible time if he had had to drive in circles through an orchard. Grandpa slowed down until Emily was afraid the engine would stop. She grabbed the edge of the Ford beside the seat cushion and pulled herself up on the running board, and then she flopped in the seat. Whew! She had made it. "Good work," Emily said Grandpa, and drove in a straight line down the wagon road once more. Emily leaned back and concentrated on catching her breath before the next gate. If she had done it once, she could do it again. She had to or be towed back by horses. At the second gate, Grandpa began to circle once more. Emily opened the door, for an instant glad that Mama could not see her now, and leaped bravely through the air. She stumbled again, but managed not to fall. She must be getting the hang of it. Once more, she slipped off the wire hoop. This gate creaked, and Emily could not ride it. She had to shove. Grandpa straightened out his driving and went through. Emily tried not to breathe dust while she struggled to close the gate, and Grandpa circled through the oats until she could scramble aboard. Phew! That was hard work. Emily hoped that she had enough strength left for the third and the last gate. That gate was in view of some farm buildings. Grandpa circled slowly. Emily took a deep breath and leaped. Yes, she did seem to have the hang of it because she landed on her feet. She ran to the gate, unfastened it, and tried to pull it open. It still would not budge. Desperately, Emily shoved. What if Grandpa ran out of gas while he was circling around? "Can you lift it, Emily?" Grandpa yelled as he drove past. Emily lifted. The gate budged, but that was all. Emily lifted again and managed to get the gate partway open, but not enough for an automobile to pass through. She wondered if it would be too selfish to ask God to help her this one little thing. "Don't stop, Grandpa," she begged. "I'll think of something." An inquisitive calf came bounding across the barnyard to see what was going on. It would be dreadful if he got through the gate. Emily would never be able to catch him in that big field, and Grandpa really would run out of gas while she tried. She put one hand on the gate post and the other on the gate. The calf frolicked over and nuzzled her with a moist nose. "Shoo!" she cried. "Go away!" The farmer came out of the barn with a pitchfork in his hands. "What the Sam Hill is going on here?" he yelled, dropping the pitchfork and running toward Emily. "Don't stop, Grandpa," pleaded Emily, as the calf licked her face with its long, wet tongue. "I'll ask the man to open the gate." "What are you driving around in my oats for?" demanded the farmer. "I can't stop," yelled Grandpa. "I'll never get her started again." "Please open the gate for us," begged Emily, shoving at the calf with her foot. If only the farmer would help them out. The farmer began to laugh. "Beat it, Buttercup," he said, slapping the calf on the rump. Then he opened the gate for Emily. "Oh, thank you," said Emily with great feeling. "Thank you ever so much." She hoped she was doing a good job of thanking the farmer. If Grandpa felt that he had to thank him too, he might think he had to stop. No, it was all right. Grandpa was circling the barnyard, skillfully avoiding 3 chickens and the bounding Buttercup. The farmer stood watching Emily with something like admiration as she leaped to the running board when Grandpa drove away. "Thank you," she called again, to make sure, as she flopped into the seat. "Thank you, sir," Grandpa yelled above the noise of the engine. "You're welcome," the farmer yelled back. "Next time, get a horse." Gracious! Emily hoped the farmer did not get to town often. She did not want this adventure to get around Pitchfork. Grandpa would never hear the last of it, and Mama might not let her go driving again. "Yes, sir, Emily," said Grandpa as they headed back towards Pitchfork. "I always said you were a humdinger." The ride back to town was peaceful enough, although Emily was a little nervous lest they meet a cow in the middle of the road that might force them to stop. It would be awful if they had to stop now after all that they had been through. When they came to Main Street, she said, "I can walk home from the store, Grandpa, as easy as not." "All right, Emily," agreed Grandpa. "You know, I have a feeling your mother might not think too highly of what went on this morning. Probably I shouldn't have let you do it. Maybe we had better keep it a secret, you and me." "Yes, let's," agreed Emily, who was happy that Grandpa wasn't going to tell either. Secrets were fun, and she was pleased that she and Grandpa had one, all of their very own. "Whoa!" cried Grandpa, stopping in front of the store just as if there was nothing wrong with his Model T. Old George A. Barbie would be only too happy to tell him how to fix it. When Emily climbed out with Mrs. Scott's 3 books and the bouquet of columbine, she discovered her legs felt wobbly. "Thank you for the ride, Grandpa," she said, not feeling the least bit like a humdinger. Grandpa's eyes twinkled. "Thank you, Emily. I don't know what I'd have done without you." He meant it, too. Emily walked home on shaky legs. No running or skipping this morning. She found Mama on the back porch doing some washing, which seemed surprising until Emily realized that it was only mid-morning, even though she felt that she had been gone for a very long time. "What lovely columbine!" Mama smiled over the ringer. "Did you have a nice ride, Emily?" "Oh, yes, Mama." Wearily, Emily sat down on the back steps to rest. "But, Mama, I don't think many people will want to read Mrs. Scott's donation." "Oh, that's too bad." Mama folded a pair of overalls so that they would go through the ringer. "And, Mama," said Emily, "the most exciting thing happened. I was waved at by an aviator. An airplane flew over and I waved at him and he waved back." "Why, Emily, that's the 2nd airplane that has been around here this year." Mama guided the overalls into a washtub of rinse water. "Just think, it was only about 75 years ago that your pioneer ancestors came here by covered wagon, and now your grandfather is driving his automobile and airplanes are flying over." She fished another pair of overalls from the suds in the washing machine. "Emily, your grandfather is right. Times are changing, and he is right to keep up with them, even at his age." As Emily bent over to examine her skinned knee, she could not help thinking that it had been all she could do to keep up with Grandpa's tin Lizzy. And that is the end of chapter 4. So let's look at our pictures. Here is a picture of the Tin Lizzy and the airplane way up in the sky flying over, and Emily waving up at the airplane. Then we have a picture, let me get to it here, of the farmer running out with a pitchfork while Emily is trying to keep the calf from escaping through the gate. They had an adventure, didn't they? And that is the end of chapter 4. And next time we will read chapter 5 of Emily's Runaway Imagination. And this is Grandma Carla, and I love you.